Hey guys, so today I'd like to talk about how to remember chord changes or certain notes in a riff or anything to do with musical memorization basically. One thing I've noticed with a lot of musicians is that many times they'll play a song and just get stuck at a certain part and forget what's going to happen next in the arrangement. And for whatever reason, I seem to have a really good memory for song arrangements. I can listen to a song just a few times and then pretty much memorize the whole thing. So I'm going to attempt to share some tips and see if I can teach how to do this. I don't actually know if I can teach this, although I do believe it's a skill that can be exercised, so we're going to try this out. So the first thing is familiarity. You've got to listen to the song a lot. I think a lot of people listen to music in the background, even musicians, and they know the song, they recognize it when they hear it, but they don't know the song intimately, I guess you could say. They haven't really paid attention to the specific chord changes or how long till they go to another section or how long they hold certain pauses for, things like that. They don't really have that stuff committed to memory, and you've really got to listen to a song over and over again to achieve that. In a couple weeks, I'm going to be playing for a church event with some other musicians, and I was sent a set list with 18 songs. 8 of them I already knew, fortunately, but 10 of them were completely new to me. So the first thing I did was make a playlist on YouTube of all these songs, and I've just been listening to that playlist over and over again just to get these songs in my head. So you should listen to a song enough to where you can sing it without listening to the music. You remember how the intro goes, you remember when the vocals kick in, you should be able to remember the words, and you remember, how long until the next phrase comes in. You should have all that stuff memorized, maybe even before you try learning the song. If you can do that, then when it comes to learning the song, basically all you're doing, you're just jamming to it in your head, and then you're just kind of playing along with it, playing in your head, if that kind of makes sense. It's sort of weird to describe, but you shouldn't be trying to remember, what the next part's going to be. You shouldn't even have to think, oh man, what is the next part, You should just be, in the moment, just, hearing the music and playing along with it. The next thing, you've got to manage your consumption of the music. So what I mean by that is when you're starting to learn a song, don't just set out to learn the song from beginning to end. And don't just play and mess up and start over. You got to break it into sections. A good example of this is the song Prequel to the Sequel by Between the Buried and Me. If any of you are familiar with Between the Buried and Me, their average song is 8 to 10 minutes long, and some of them are even longer. This particular song is about 7 or 8 minutes long. And it doesn't even have a distinctive chorus that repeats or anything like that. It's more like a musical theme that just continues to progress. Learning a song like that, there's just no way I could listen from beginning to the end and learn all the parts and be able to memorize that. Now, because the song was so difficult, that was actually to my benefit, because it forced me to learn the song little by little. So I started with the intro. The very first part of the intro goes like this. That one section alone, there is no way I can think about all the individual notes I'm doing. That's impossible. There's no way you can process, okay, this finger goes there, and, think about all those little nuances and then tell your brain fast enough for your hands to react. You've got to break it into sections first. That whole section there, you could break that into 4 parts. So we start with just a power chord on the low E. Then we've got this grouping of notes here. Then the next grouping. And then the final group. And then what you're going to do is you're just going to link these parts together. So we start with our power chord, and then we go, and that's it. And you do it again. And again, until you're not having to think so much about it. Then you add the next group. Eventually, you've learned a whole section of the song. You keep piecing it together. Eventually, you've got the whole intro. Once you've got that down, you learn the next section of the song, get that down, then you combine the two together. Once you've got that, then you proceed into learning the next part of the song. For this particular song, I kept doing that for probably several weeks, maybe a couple months or something. And eventually, I learned the whole song. And because I'd been playing those parts so many times, I basically knew this song inside and out. I didn't need to listen to it to remember, oh, what comes after this part? I could remember that whole 7-minute song. Now, the funny thing is, I think songs with riffs like that, in terms of memory, are actually a little bit easier than typical chord songs. Because there are several songs that use standard G chord and go to C, There's 100 songs, 1,000 songs that do that, But I can't think of any other songs that do that. As soon as I hear that, hey, that's prequel to the sequel. So that's something that kind of helps with the memorization. If you are playing general chords, then that's going to go along with this next tip, which is practice and repetition. You've got to do it over and over again. Once you've learned something, the only way you're going to be able to remember the order is by putting your hands on autopilot. In other words, you're kind of letting your hands do all the work so that you don't have to remember. You practice that arrangement, you practice those transitions so many times that you're not thinking about them. Because you don't have time, especially when you're going to start playing in front of somebody. There's so much pressure that you have to sort of rely on your practice and your repetition to take over. Here's a song I wrote that uses basic chords. This one's called It's Time. So first off, I wrote this song, so obviously I know it intimately. But I know some people who write their own songs and then they can't remember how the parts go, but we'll talk about that later. Those little licks actually kind of help chain things together, because what I do is I use them as sort of a transition. And I just repeat that over and over till I'm familiar with how it feels. So that when I play in the actual song, I'm not thinking about what chord I'm going to next, I'm just focusing on the feeling, and I'm just kind of remembering how the song goes in my head. And that's really all it is. I just kind of remember how it feels to play it right. And I think that's what's important, is practice, and when you can hear that you're playing it correctly, stop looking so much and start just feeling, and try to remember how it feels when you play it right, and try to replicate that feeling over and over again. I don't play too many songs with typical chords, but one song I do play that uses chords is Casimir Pulaski Day by Sufjan Stevens. It's only 4 chords, so I feel like that should be pretty easy. It's just D, C, A minor, and G, you know? And sure, there's some little like melodic embellishes in there, but for the most part, it's just those chords. So if you're practicing a song like that, that's why it's so important that you listen to it over and over again, so you can hear the proper chord progression. And you need to know not only what it sounds like to go from a D to a C, but what it feels like to go from a D to a C. So you play it so many times that if you were to play it and go to an A, not only would it sound wrong, it would feel wrong too. So repetition, practice and repetition. Do it over and over and over and over until you're not thinking about it anymore. In fact, the funny thing is, if I think too much about what I'm playing, usually that's when I mess up. It's also important to take notes of the parts that you keep messing up at. So if you're learning a certain song and there's this one section you just keep going to the wrong chord, or you just always kind of draw a blank on it, you need to focus on that section and work on the transition. Keep playing that until you smooth out that kink, and then try playing it in context with the rest of the song. And so kind of building off of that, the next tip is to have some kind of recording to help you remember what you're playing. Sometimes just the act of recording something, writing it down, or videotaping it, creates a stamp on what it is you're trying to remember. For example, if you have to pick up your nephew tomorrow from school and you don't want to forget, you don't just write it down so that the note itself reminds you. It's actually the act of writing it down that kind of makes you remember. At least for me, you know, I'll write it down, then the next day I wake up and I remember to do it without even looking at the note. And so I think it's the same thing with music. You can physically record yourself playing, or if there's a certain place you mess up, maybe just write it down. Hey, I always mess up here, remember to do this. And I think just by doing that, you're going to put a stamp on that thing, and it's going to stick out to you a lot more, especially when you mess up, because you're going to know why you messed up, what you did wrong. Now earlier I mentioned writing your own songs and having trouble remembering what you wrote. One tip for that is to not record it. It's like, but I thought you just said to record. It's like, well, what I mean is, if what you wrote is any good, if it's actually catchy, then it's probably going to get stuck in your head. Now trust me, I record my ideas all the time. I've got a phone that is just full of all these musical ideas. But if you're trying to come up with a melody or something, a lot of times, if it's any good, it's going to get stuck in your head and you're not going to forget it. A good example of that is when I started playing guitar for our praise band. I was assigned to play lead guitar, and I didn't even know how to play lead guitar, but the first thing I kind of realized was, oh, okay, so I'm kind of just playing melodies in between the vocal parts. So I would write stuff, and most of the time I would write this stuff during practice or, rehearsal, or just, on the spot. And so I wasn't actually writing it down or recording it. So what would happen was, if I wrote something that actually fit really well and sounded good, it would stick with the song, and I'd remember it every time. years later, you know, I don't even play lead guitar for our praise band anymore, but if I hear a song, I can remember the lead part I wrote for it. Vice versa, you know, if I would write something and then forget about it, it didn't really matter. It probably wasn't that good anyway, so then I would keep writing something new until something would stick. And then the last thing I want to encourage you is to stop relying on sheets of music. So many people, they'll get a print of the lyrics and they'll write the chords above them, and whenever they're playing the song, they're just kind of like reading along, and that's not how you should play music, man. You're not even like, you can't even really appreciate the music if that's what you're doing. You should know the song so well that when you're playing it, all you're doing is just expressing yourself through the song. And that's what's so important, especially as an artist. Even people who play with sheet music, with all the notes and dots and stuff, when they're playing sheet music, they're not reading those individual notes. That's not what's telling them what to do. Through practice and repetition, they remember the shapes, and they sort of use it as a guide, but they don't have to rely on that sheet of music to remember how to play the song. At least I'm certain that they don't have to. Because there's just no way they could read it. Some of the crazy like piano pieces and stuff, there's no way you can read that and play it instinctively. And that's one thing, to have a guide, but to have like a handicap, that's another thing. For me, I can't even look at lyrics with the chords written over top. My ears are just much faster than my eyes. If I try to read the chord and then try to think, okay, I need to play this, it just doesn't work. I work better when I'm actually listening to the music and just going to the chord based on what I'm hearing. What you need to do is you need to exercise your ear more. You can use it to learn the song, but once you are fairly familiar with the song, get rid of it and test yourself. And it's not until you put yourself in that situation where you have to remember it are you going to be able to exercise it. And if you keep forgetting, look at it, get your reminder, and then just keep working. It's like flashcards, you know? If you're studying something and you have to remember through the cards, you might mess up a few times, but you just keep practicing, you keep doing that, and eventually that memorization kicks in and you're just instinctively looking at it and you're like, oh, I know what that is. And it's the same thing with music. But yeah, I hope that was helpful. It's kind of a hard thing to teach, and I may do some more like kind of ear training videos in the future, but I hope this kind of gives you some ideas on how to exercise your ear and some things that you can try, just, you know, practicing, and hopefully you can start remembering your song arrangements a lot easier. Until next time.